أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. الصلاة والسلام على الإمام الهدى والمتقين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. قال الله عز وجل: والسماء والطارق وما أدراك ما الطارق النجم الثاقب إن كل نفس لما عليه حافظ فلينظر الإنسان مما خلق من ماء دافق يخرج من بين الصلب والترائب إنه على رجعه لقادر يوم تبلى السرائر فما له من قوة ولا ناصر. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah Al-Tariq, He draws our attention initially to His creation, to the celestial bodies. He says, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ. And then later on, as the surah goes, He makes a connection to our own creation. And the reason I'm bringing these ayat is in relation to our topic today, which is God, doubt, and black holes. And I'll come to these ayat a little later, but I want to set a few things in place, and then we'll look at these ayat and how it relates to a certain reality that we just noticed recently. As I think many of us are aware, just last week there was a major scientific discovery that was publicized quite vividly in the media and in scientific literature, etc., where they published a picture of a black hole. And I think everyone has probably seen it. I'm going to try and pull this up here in a second of what this picture looks like. I'm pretty sure everyone has seen this particular image, correct? Okay, so this image, I think we need to kind of understand this image properly so that how we relate it to our understanding as Muslims, and how does it relate to us believing in Islam and believing in this particular reality. What they have done, and who has a science major, by the way? Anybody raise your hands here? Okay, just one guy? Okay, two. Okay, mashallah. Okay, so a lot of people, right? But just to understand, I'm not going to go through the whole science of the black hole and all of that stuff, but just a little bit of understanding so that we're all on the same page. So this particular galaxy that they looked at where the black hole exists is called Messier 87. It's about 55 million light years from our planet. And this particular density of black hole is about 6.5 billion times the size of the Earth. So it's a massive object. It's 6.5 billion times the mass of our own sun. So what they did was, to view such an image, to view such a body of mass, you need essentially a telescope the size of the Earth. But obviously we can't have that. So what they did was they viewed this particular area in that particular galaxy, Messier 87, by directing 8 telescopes around the globe to look at that particular region. And over a period of 2 years, they were able to gather all the data and analyze it, and then the final image was what we saw, right? And just to understand what this image is, so the center part where the black perimeter starts, that is called the event horizon. So the program was named after that, the Event Horizon Scope. And this orange thing that you're seeing is what is where mass gases, material, etc., is moving almost at the speed of light and creating so much heat that it creates this appearance in the telescopic image that we got. So that ring, the red ring that you're seeing, that is called the accretion disk. Okay? So the red ring is called the accretion disk, and the black hole is what's within that accretion disk. That perimeter is the event horizon. Now what this issue is that this is what Einstein had predicted, that there is, in the general theory of relativity, that there can be a mass that is so dense and that is so unique in its nature, it is so small that it can bend light. So what we're actually seeing, and when they say that, look, we took a picture of the black hole, that's not actually accurate. Because the black hole, you can't actually see it because the light, it absorbs all the light. So you won't be able to reflect off of it to actually see it. Okay? So what you're seeing on that particular image is not the black hole, rather you're seeing the effects of that entity and of what it's doing to the mass around it. Okay? Do you guys follow this, right? So you're not actually seeing the black hole. What we have done is, or what the scientists have done, is that they're making an inference, a deduction, that just because of how the accretion disk looks and how hot it is around that area, it is predicting that there has to be something called a black hole in there. You guys follow this, right? So in reality, you can't actually see a black hole because it takes all the light. What you're seeing is the effects of that particular entity and how the masses and the gases, what they call the plasma, how it's moving around that particular area. And there's a whole lot of dynamics to this and how it's moving, what sort of rotation it is, and so on and so forth. But we're not going to go into that. But that is what I think we should understand. So the key point is this, is that you're seeing the effects of something, of an entity, and that's what's observable, and that's what the scientists presented. Now the question is, this is a new scientific discovery, and every few years we have scientific discoveries that are made. A few years ago we have the Higgs particle, if you guys remember that. I don't know if anybody knows that. Okay. So how do we as Muslims look at this particular new scientific discovery? Does this prove God, or does this disprove God? For us, this is an important question. Okay? Does this prove the existence of an almighty creator, or does this negate his existence? How do we see this discovery in the light of the Quran, of the Quranic verses, when Allah Azza wa Jalla talks about the sun, the moon, the stars, and so on and so forth? How do we look at this? And so before we go to that, I want to build a stage of where we are as a people. We live in an era of doubt, where it's an era of fake news. It's an era of propaganda. It's an era where you don't know what's true and what's false. Do you guys agree with this? Right? There is, fake news stuff. There is that sort of imagery. There is that sort of trend. There is that sort of what you may call influence in this dunya. Okay? It's an era of doubt. There is nothing that's very clear. And this is living in Western societies, you will see that. On the contrary, there is another part also to this, is that we live in an era of science as well, where we as a human nation, as a nation, as a human being, we are able to discover scientific discoveries. We're able to look at the cell. We're able to look at celestial bodies. We're able to look at the moon, the stars. We can look at all of this, and we are able to deduce, experiment, etc. And we're knowing stuff that hundreds of years ago we had no idea about, right? The embryonic cycle, this and that, etc. So it's an era of science as well. Now, how do we understand this? How do we put this together, right? How do we put this together where there is so much misinformation, where there is so much doubt, where there is, and then there is science that talks about absolute truths, that talks about that this science that we study is basically godlike. We live in an era where science is considered to be the absolute determining factor of what is true and what is false. And this is what is taught to us in school and so forth, that science is the determining factor. How do we relate these two things? This is where, I look at certain hadith that talk about the Yawm al-Akhirah. And this used to concern me a lot, is that Allah Azza wa Jalla, Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he informs us that knowledge at the end of times, one of the minor signs is that knowledge will be taken away from the people, that there will be ignorance. The ignorance will prevail. That people will be able to read, but they will have ignorance. These are one of the minor signs of the Day of Judgment. And then there will be scholars, there will be a lot of people who can speak, but they lack knowledge. They're not fuqaha, they're not scholars. There will be, another sign is there won't be trustworthiness. That trustworthiness will be hard to find. You don't know who to trust, you don't know who to trust, you don't know who to believe in. There is so much falsehood that's out there. And this is something that I really used to think, is that how can that be? How can that be that you are not able to distinguish between truth and falsehood? And now, living in this time, I can see that. I can see how there is so much falsehood that's out there that you're not able to distinguish true and false. You're not able to distinguish what is correct and what is wrong unless you have a certain viewpoint of life, unless there is something that's directing you to figure something out. So this is where we are. There is Allah Azza wa Jal, He talks about these things. And He says, look, أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, that majority of the people, they don't know. Majority of the people, they disbelieve. Majority of the people are following erroneous ideas. And Allah Azza wa Jal, He says, look, the real knowledge, and how do you understand these two things? How do you understand the issue of doubt versus the issue of living in an era where the science is essentially God, essentially the thing that determines haqq and batil in the Western society more specifically. To do this, we need to look back at the Quran. We need to look back and say, look, how does Islam look at this thing? Islam defines that, look, knowledge is not about how much information you have. It's not how much you know about the atoms and the electrons and so on and so forth. That's just information. It's about how you take that information and how you relate it to the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's how you relate that ilm, that knowledge, to the purpose of life. How do you relate it to your akhirah? How do you relate it to Jannah and Nar? So if you have all of this scientific knowledge, if you can write PhD style papers, you can write all of this scientific knowledge, but you deny the creator, then you're ignorant, right? You can have a PhD, you can have all of the scientific knowledge about the universe, about physics, about how galaxies work, but you worship your desires, or you worship a created being, you could worship a cow, then you're not a person who has ilm, you're not a person who has knowledge. Rather, you are one of those where Allah Azza wa Jalla said, أَكْثَرَ النَّاسِ لَا يَعْلَمُونَ, that you do not know because you are denying Allah's existence. So this is where now it brings me to this particular surah, How do we understand this? How do we understand the cause and effect? So what we're seeing in that particular image is that you're seeing the effect of a particular body. And by deductive reasoning, by rational thinking, you have made that conclusion that that black hole exists. Similarly, when we look at the surroundings, when we look at the creation, when we look at what's outside, when we look at the sun, the stars, the moon, and so on and so forth, you are making that deductive reasoning. You're looking at it rationally and you said, look, there has to be something that is beyond what I am seeing, that is controlling everything, that is beyond the finite and dependent reality that I'm seeing, right? So that particular issue is where you say, look, Allah Azza wa Jalla exists because I can see His creation. Science cannot. It's a mechanistic procedure. It can give you how things function. It can tell me how my laptop functions. It can tell me how a camera functions. It can tell me how light rays function. It can tell me how the orbits of galaxies are. It can measure things. What science cannot do is it cannot answer the question, why? Why does it exist? Why is the earth going around the sun? Why do I exist? What is my purpose in life? Science cannot do that. Science cannot give you that answer. It can tell you how it functions, but it cannot give you the answer of why that particular issue exists. So for example, the electron, its charge is negative 1.6 times 10 raised to the negative 19 coulombs. 1.6 times 10 raised to the negative 19 coulombs. A very, very specific number. It's not negative 19, it's not negative 20, it's not negative 18, it's negative 19. 1.6 times 10 raised to the negative 19 coulombs. This is a very specific number. So science can tell you what an electron is. It can tell you what it measures, but it cannot tell you why it exists. What's the purpose? It cannot give you that answer, because science only deals with what is material and what it can experiment with, what it can see, right? Your rational thinking goes beyond that. Your deductive reasoning as a human being goes beyond that. It can answer the question of why. So every person at one point in his life, whether he's a male, female, Muslim, or non-Muslim, they've asked this question: why am I here? What is my purpose in life? Who created me? What will happen when I die? Would you agree? Every person has actually asked these questions. And these are fundamental questions to our existence, right? Science cannot give you that answer. It can't. It can tell you how your liver functions, it can tell you how your heart functions, but it can't give you the answer of why you exist. And for that, you need your deductive reasoning. For that, you have to realize that, look, I am a created being because I have limits, I have dependencies, and I need somebody to make me. Correct? So therefore, that entity has to be beyond my reality. It cannot be within that reality. So this laptop doesn't create itself. There has to be a person who made this laptop. There has to be a person who put, look, this has to have 14-inch screen, it has to have certain battery life, it has to power on certain voltage, it has to have certain memory life. So I, as the maker, I'm putting these limits. I, as a maker, I'm putting these specifications. It doesn't create itself. I, as a maker of this laptop, I am the one who is forming the laws by which this thing functions. So similarly, when we look at the universe, we see this, that the universe is bound by certain principles. It is bound by certain laws. So gravity, for example. And this is the whole issue of special theory of relativity, right? It's the issue of gravity. Gravity exists. It exists on this world, it exists in the universe, it exists between stars and planets. This is a specific law that doesn't change. We can measure it, we can sense it, but we cannot answer why it's there. And that's why when you have two things, when you can see the dependencies and the limits of certain bodies, and then you can see that, look, they're bound by certain laws, then there has to be an entity that puts those limits and dependencies, to puts those laws in place. And that entity cannot be within that same system, because then he would be part of that same limitations. This brings me to this particular surah now. When you understand things in that manner, that the image that you're seeing the effects of an entity, and by deductive reasoning, by rational thinking, you've made the assumption, you've made the determination that, look, there is something that I don't see, but it exists, right? And that is where the issue is, and that's something that they have not particularly, articulated to the public, right? You're not able to see the black hole because light cannot reflect off of it, but you see the effects. Similarly, you take that same analogy, the same deductive reasoning, and you apply that to the rest of the universe, to apply that to your whole kainat, to your own creation. You see, with deductive reasoning, with rational thinking, you're able to say, look, Allah Azza wa Jalla exists, because I see His creation. I see those limitations. I see those dependencies that the creation has. And hence, there has to be something beyond those limitations, dependencies, beyond the parameters of this universe that is making it function. So in this surah, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ, by the sky and the thing that's coming by night, by the comer of night, al-Tariq. Al-Wahidi, Imam Al-Wahidi, in his book Asbab al-Nuzul, The Reasons of Revelation, he narrates that this was revealed about Abu Talib, the surah. He says that once Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he was visiting Abu Talib, and Abu Talib offered him bread and milk. And as Abu Talib was sitting down and eating, a meteor fell. Sorry, excuse me. I've been having a reflux all day today. Apologize. A meteor fell, and there was a huge sound that came, and there was fire and so forth. So Abu Talib got scared, and he asked Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, what on earth is this? So Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, he says that this is a meteor that was thrown, and it was one of the signs of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. So you see how Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, when he sees this event happening, he connects it with that this is a sign of a sign of Allah Subhanahu wa Ta'ala. So Imam Al-Wahidi, he says that, look, this was revealed at that time, وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ, by the sky and the comer of the night. At-Tariq is, when we say Tariq, it's a active particle, the way that Allah is using this thing. It's an At-Tariq, an active particle of the word tariq, right? It's a path. You take a path to something. وَمَا أَدْرَاكَ مَا الطَّارِقِ. Allah Azza wa Jalla, now He's asking this question, what do you know about this At-Tariq? He's mentioned وَالسَّمَاءِ وَالطَّارِقِ, something that came down by light. Came down by night. Allah Azza wa Jalla is asking, what do you know about this? And He replies to that in the next ayah, saying, النجم الثاقب, that it is a piercing star. So if you look at these three ayat, you can say that, look, it's about that comet that fell down. You can make that deduction, saying that this is about that comet that fell down, that it came by night, and what do you know about this? And it is a piercing star. It is so bright, it has a piercing nature to it. The other way of looking at this ayah is that the term At-Tariq also means to knock, right? It also means to knock. It makes a noise. So if someone is coming, someone is on a path, someone's knocking. There's another way of looking at this. At-Tariq is something that you're knocking. And then the ayah says, An-Najm al-Thaqib. So the term thuqub means a hole. And Thaqib means the one who makes that hole. So the Quran is also describing, in another sense, is describing a knocking star that makes a hole. Now think about the black hole and think about the comet. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, I'm not, this is how you can look at the terminology and you can see how it can fit the reality. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not restricting you to look at it in one way, but the terms that are being used give you that ability to say, look, it means a knocking star, a piercing star, and this is from the English translation and so forth. Allah Azza wa Jalla is describing a reality that was seen at that time by Abu Talib and Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. And this ayah is also relevant to us. So when we look at the sky, we see a bright star. We can see a comet. We can see this image that we saw. This image of the black hole that we saw. And there have been experiments that have now proven that the universe makes a noise. There's actually audio tape, and you can actually listen to the noise of the universe. You can go to NASA's website and you can actually listen to what they have discovered as the noise that the universe makes. They've recorded this. Now, if we look at this, this is where the Quran is talking about a reality that exists in front of us. The Quran is not talking about a fantasy. The Quran, and anytime Allah Azza wa Jalla, He talks about the sun, the moon, the planets, He talks about the creation, He talks about how plants grow, He talks about how the earth splits apart, He talks about the mountains. He's giving us examples of what we can observe, what we can sense with our own eyes, by touch, by feel, by listening, by smelling, by the five senses we have. He is not talking about some fantasy that you and I cannot sense. He's not talking about Star Wars or Star Trek, right? He's not talking about Klingon language and whatever stuff is there. He's not talking about Yoda and all these things that we cannot see or feel. Allah Azza wa Jalla, He's talking to us because He's talking to us in a manner that is simple, in a manner that we understand, in a manner that we can sense. So when Allah Azza wa Jalla, He's telling us to look within the Quran, look at your creation, look at the earth, the moon, the sun, and so on and so forth. He's making you think about His creation so that you realize that there is a creator. So you realize that you are created. So you realize that Allah Azza wa Jalla is the one who runs everything. He's making it simple so that even a child can understand. And Allah Azza wa Jal, and that's where we come in. That's where, when we look at these scientific experiments, when we look at these scientific discoveries, it is an affirmation to our understanding that everything is created. It doesn't disprove Allah. It actually reinforces our yaqeen that Allah Azza wa Jal exists. You guys follow this, right? It has to reinforce that because of our understanding. We're not limited by science and its own methods, right? Because science is restricted, that it can only sense what it can only experiment on, what it can observe. Our deductive reasoning, our mind, our rational thinking can go beyond that. It can go beyond that to realize that it can answer those questions. Why am I here? What is my purpose? Right? You can ask those questions. And then revelation comes, and revelation tells you your purpose is such and such. How do you fulfill your ibadat? Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam comes and tells you. It's mentioned in the Quran. How do you go to Hajj? Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam mentions it. The Quran mentions it, so on and so forth. But your own mind can deduce that there is a creator. Your own mind can deduce that there exists an entity beyond my understanding, beyond the reality that I see. And Allah Azza wa Jal, and then he sends his messenger to tell us how to worship him. He tells his messenger how to run the dunya, how to live your lives, and so on and so forth. And you can see that this is the theme that goes on in the Quran. In Surah Al-Anbiya, for example, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, هُوَ الَّذِي خَلَقَ اللَّيْلَ وَالنَّهَارَ وَالشَّمْسَ وَالْقَمَرَ كُلٌّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ. Right? It is He who has created the night and the day, and He is the one who's created the sun and the moon, and all the heavenly bodies that you're able to observe, each in a floating orbit. كُلُّ فِي فَلَكٍ يَسْبَحُونَ. That He has created everything and all these things in a floating orbit. The Bedouins on which the Quran was revealed, they had no idea about this. Right? This is something that we are able to discover later. But Allah Azza wa Jalla, He's mentioning us so that we understand, look, now we know there's an orbit that every galaxy follows, and every sun follows, the moon follows, and so on and so forth. Allah Azza wa Jalla mentions that in the Quran. Similarly, later on, Allah Azza wa Jalla in another surah, for example, Surah Al Imran, He says, إِنَّ فِي خَلْقِ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَاخْتِلَافِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ لَا يَأْتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ, right? That in the creation of the heavens and the earth, لَا يَأْتٍ لِأُولِي الْأَلْبَابِ. In the creation of the heavens and the earth, the alteration of the day and the night, these are indeed signs for a people of understanding. It's signs for the people of understanding. And remember, Allah Azza wa Jalla, where I mentioned, look, that most of the people, they don't understand. Most of the people, they don't know. Most of the people, they are in disbelief. But He's saying, look, the ones, all of these creations are for a people who are able to understand. And I'll end with this, inshallah. We'll have discussions, inshallah, afterwards. But the Quran, and this is a mistake that many people make, unfortunately. The Quran is not a book of scientific experiments, scientific miracles, right? Unfortunately, you see this on like WhatsApp messages or Facebook messages, etc. You know, you cut a tomato, you see the word of Allah in there. Oh, right? Or you say, look, Allah mentions the iron in chapter number 54. The mass of the iron is 54, and so on and so forth. Or there is the embryological cycle that's mentioned in the Quran, so therefore it's validating the Quran, these scientific miracles. That is a false understanding. Okay, we have to be very clear is that those scientific findings do not validate the Quran. The Quran is independent to this. The Quran does not need the validation of science. Right? The miracle of the Quran is the language itself. It is not a book that talks about scientific miracles. So for example, at the time of the Bedouins, the time of Rasul Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, they did not know how the moon and the sun orbit, but these ayat are revealed to them. They did not know about the embryological cycle. They did not know about the difference between salt water and fresh water, right? But they believed in the Quran with yaqeen. The reason for that is because of the Quran itself, not because of quote-unquote scientific experiments, scientific miracles that are mentioned, right? So that is what we have to take into our understanding, that look, it does not, these scientific issues do not validate the Quran. So this discovery of the black hole does not validate the Quran, say, oh, because of this now the Quran is good. Oh, because of this the Quran is the word of Allah Azza wa Jal. No, that's not how you look at it. What you look at it is that, look, we were finally able to view something that Allah Azza wa Jal had created because now we have the technology to see something. This goes back to the issue that I am able to say that I have yaqeen in Allah Azza wa Jal because I can understand His creation, that I can understand the world that I'm living in, that I can understand Allah Azza wa Jal and how He made things, right? So Islam, and this is the history of Islam. We don't have beef with science. In this world, in the Western secular world, science is considered the ultimate authority over things, the ultimate authority of right and wrong. For us, this is not the case. For us, the ultimate authority is Allah Azza wa Jal. The ultimate determination of what is good and bad, what is evil and good, what is truth and falsehood, is what Allah Azza wa Jal says, is not what my mind thinks is true or false, or what science thinks is true or false. And this is where the history of science and religion has had an issue with secular culture and Christianity. For us, alhamdulillah, we've not had that problem. For us, all these scientific experiments, all these discoveries, they are a validation to us that Allah Azza wa Jal exists. They add to the proof that Allah Azza wa Jal exists. They add to the proof that I can prove the existence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And my iman is not blind faith. My iman is by rational thinking process. So when you can say, hey, you can't prove Allah Azza wa Jal exists, you should say, as youth, everybody here, that I can prove that Allah Azza wa Jal exists. I can prove it because Islam, the way we are taught to think, allows us to give that answer. So your yaqeen, your belief, your iman in the Quran, in Allah Azza wa Jal, is built on rational thought. It's not built on blind belief. I hope, inshallah, this was of some benefit. I'll open the floor for questions, inshallah. Wa akhir da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.